Hello, and welcome to University Health's Memorial Day Observance. I'm Darrell Green, Perioperative Services Program Manager here at University Health and a United States Air Force veteran. Please join me for the singing of our national anthem by Dr. Tommy Austin, Senior Vice President and Chief Nurse Executive, followed by the invocation led by Chaplain Janine Atkinson.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Will you join me in prayer, please? God and Creator of us all, with humility and gratitude, we pause this Memorial Day to remember the lives of those who have died serving in our nation's wars and conflicts. May we never take for granted the extraordinary cost of freedom and the tremendous sacrifice that so many individuals and families have made throughout our history. May we remember and honor those who died, giving birth to a free nation, maintaining our union, ending the evil of slavery, preserving freedom and democracy both at home and abroad. Grant to us, gracious one, your consolation and comfort, as well as your guidance and grace. May we all remember and respond to these great sacrifices with a gratitude that fuels a longing for peace and a pursuit for it in our hearts, our homes, our communities, and our world. Amen.
Thank you, Tommy and Chaplain Atkinson. At this time, please join me for a moment of silence as a somber remembrance for those military service members who have fallen to defend our freedom. Thank you for viewing today's event as we honor our nation's fallen heroes. On behalf of University Health, I would like to recognize those who serve our community, state, and nation in elected or appointed leadership roles. We would also like to recognize the members of the Bexar County Hospital District Board of Managers. Thank you all for what you do. I would also like to thank all the members of the University Health staff, family and friends present and are watching with us today. Thank you all. For 153 years, our nation has observed a day to honor those who died for our freedom and way of life. The purpose of the original Decoration Day, as it was called in 1868, was to decorate the graves of the men who died during the Civil War. The tradition has been carried through all the wars since. It is now called Memorial Day, and this year it will be observed on Monday, May 31st. More than 1.1 million men and women have died in wartime throughout the span of our nation's history. To put that in perspective, that is more than the current population of Austin, Texas. Memorial Day is a chance to reconnect to the foundation of our nation's freedom. It's an important day on which we ground ourselves to the reality that every Gold Star family member knows too well. Our way of life continues because of those who served and those who have died. Dr. Brian Alsop, Chief Medical Officer at University Health, will now introduce our guest speaker.
Our keynote address this morning will be delivered by Colonel Retired Michael Visconage. Colonel Visconage is a Marine Corps Reserve veteran who served in uniform for 30 years. He now serves as the History Program Director and Chief Historian for the Department of Veterans Affairs. In this role, Colonel Visconage oversees the development of historical efforts within the programs of the Veterans Health Administration, the Veterans Benefits Administration, and the National Cemetery Administration. Mr. Visconage served in the U.S. Marine Corps in artillery, reconnaissance, and as an historian before retiring from the Marine Corps Reserve as a colonel with 30 years of service. He was mobilized as a Marine Corps field historian during the initial Iraq invasion in 2003. 2007-2008, he returned as the command historian for multinational forces in Iraq, overseeing joint service military history detachments and documenting the surge of U.S. forces during this period. Early in his career, he was a White House social aide and worked on the Presidential Inaugural Armed Forces Inaugural Committee. In addition to his military service, Mr. Visconage has over 25 years of private sector leadership experience in healthcare, franchising, and commercial construction organizations. His expertise is in strategic projects, change management, and organizational development, where he teamed with senior executives to implement a variety of new initiatives. He was also co-founder and director of the Texas World War I Centennial Commemoration from 2015 to 2019. Mr. Visconage is a graduate of the University of Maryland and holds a master's degree in business administration. He is the author of over 30 professional articles and a book on U.S. Marine Corps aviation operations in Iraq. His military decorations include the Legion of Merit and the Bronze Star Medal.
Memorial Day is uniquely linked to the founding concept of the American democracy. To understand that unique relationship between our nation and our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, we really need to look back to the European model that was the reference point for our founders at the time of the American colonies. If you traveled in France in the mid-1700s and stopped at an inn for the night, it was not uncommon to see a sign outside of the inn that read, "Interdit aux chiens, aux prostituées et aux soldats." No dogs, prostitutes, or soldiers allowed. If you were grievously wounded in 16th century Britain, we have early examples of the begging license that you might have received to be allowed to legally beg on the streets of London. And if you were killed in the Battle of Waterloo, the ceremony honoring your ultimate sacrifice was that a large pit was dug, and all of the bodies, to include the dead horses, were pushed into the pit, and either they were burned or covered and left unmarked. Unless you were a nobleman or an officer, you were unknown. All of these speak to the status of soldiers in the European model. Soldiers were held in low regard. Typically, they were mercenaries, opportunists, or at best conscripts. But the American experiment reframed that relationship, and it was the relationship that was between a free nation and their citizen soldiers. Specifically, that relationship, in terms of her free nation's solemn remembrance of those who gave their lives in defense of the nation, is highlighted in the idea of Memorial Day. I'd like to share a little bit about the two ways in which we as a free nation have treated our war dead, our unknown dead and our known dead. The remembrance of war dead always included the missing or unidentified, monuments to American unknowns or to those whose remains who could not be identified or recovered. This included men lost at sea, unrecovered during the heat of the battle, or ultimately whose remains simply could not be identified by those who survived the battle. In the first half of the 1800s, early in our nation's history, mass graves were used for soldiers killed in the Second Seminole War and in the U.S.-Mexico War. The idea of being killed in battle and being left as unknown was troubling to soldiers. We have the diaries of Civil War soldiers that often remarked about this concern, and they would often put their name on a piece of paper in one of the pockets of their uniform in the hope that if they'd been killed, that someone would still be able to identify them. Still, approximately 45% of Civil War dead were unknown. Clara Barton's sometimes overlooked role, amongst her many others, was that at the end of the war, she established the Missing Soldiers Office, specifically with the goal of finding a way to answer letters from family members trying to determine the fate of sons, fathers, husbands, brothers who never returned. By the Spanish-American War, record-keeping and the scale of the war reduced unknown dead to just 14% of those who'd been killed. The Great War brought a scale of destruction not previously seen. Between America's entry in the war in April of 1917 until the armistice on November 11 of 1918, over 116,000 Americans died in uniform. Technology amplified the number of dead who could not be recognized. Simultaneously, it did aid some of the recognition in the introduction of the service identification tag, what we know as the dog tag, as a way to identify soldiers who were killed. Ultimately, 4% of American deaths remained unknown at the end of World War I. Over 100 years ago, on March 4th of 1921, the United States began the process of recovering an unknown service member from the battlefields of World War I France. Historian Kara Newcomer described Congress's decision. Although the idea of honoring the unknown war dead of World War I originated in Europe, America embraced the idea. The United States Congress approved, by public resolution, the burial of an unknown American soldier in the plaza of the new Memorial Amphitheater in Arlington National Cemetery. It was decided, after much discussion and debate, that the unknown soldier would be brought home from France and laid to rest in his native land. Newcomer goes on to describe the scene at the dedication of the tomb of the unknown soldier later that year on November 11th of 1921. As the casket was lowered into the tomb, the bottom of which was lined with a layer of soil from France, the saluting battery fired 3 salvos. A lone bugler then sounded taps before the gun battery fired 21 guns in final salute. In the Second World War, 6,000 of the 405,300 war dead were unidentified, now just down to 1.5% of our war dead. By the wars in Korea and Vietnam, the identification more specifically became those of the missing in action. With much more known about dates, times, and places and circumstance of their disappearance and death, it became more predominantly a matter of missing remains, lost in a sunken warship, missing wreckage in an aircraft, or in enemy hands that were simply not accessible. By the 21st century, the use of technology brought the era of the unknown soldier to an end. While we still have cases of missing servicemen DNA preserved as part of the initial enlistment process, even the remains recovered from previous conflicts are now frequently identified by matching DNA from surviving family members. We've talked about our unknown, but I want to talk about our known war dead and how our free nation has treated those remains. The U.S. Civil War brought a previously unseen scale of battle to the American soil. 2% of the American population died during the war because of that conflict. It was the first large-scale effort also to create a process for honoring the war dead. The wartime expedient cemeteries were formalized in the National Cemetery Act of 1867, 2 years after the end of the war. This created a national cemetery system which provided burial space for Union war dead. Individual graves were allotted, and specific guidelines for headboards were initially part of those common specifications. By 1872, 305,497 remains were buried in 74 national cemeteries and soldiers' lots. These were typically located very close to the battlefields, near hospitals, and at railhead areas. In 1917, the U.S. stepped onto the world stage, and service members who died on foreign shores raised new challenges. While recovery of remains was not unusual, the commitment of the U.S. to systematically recover and return war dead, particularly in the efforts after World War I and World War II, were unique. At the conclusion of World War I, families were given the option to have their fallen returned home. 65% elected that option, and 46,520 remains were returned back to the United States. Over 30,000 remains, families had elected to remain in the European theater. These were interred in 6 American cemeteries located in France, Belgium, and England. These would later come under the stewardship of the American Battle Monuments Commission when established in 1923. At the conclusion of World War II, the Return of the Dead program was initiated. This was an unprecedented program that began in 1947 and concluded in 1951. To give you a sense of the scale of this endeavor, over $2 billion, measured in 2019 dollars, was allocated for the Return of the Dead program, as well as a uniformed and civilian workforce of 13,000. The American Graves Registration Service recovered the remains of 280,000 service members from theaters around the globe. Next of kin could choose to have remains returned to a home cemetery, to a national cemetery in the United States, or to be laid to rest in designated American cemeteries on foreign soil. Remains were carefully exhumed from wartime cemeteries. Ceremonies and honors were common at every step of the journey. When the first group of remains left Europe from Antwerp, Belgium, the entire town paraded to the transport ship to show their respect. Upon arrival at ports in New York and San Francisco, hundreds of thousands lined the streets as remains were offloaded from the transport ships and transferred to temporary distribution depots. Military escorts from each service then escorted individual remains to each of their final destinations. 171,752 remains were returned to the continental United States by the conclusion of the Return of the Dead program. Today, in our national cemeteries, we also honor veterans who survived but ultimately passed on, as we all must. The National Cemetery Administration, part of the Department of Veterans Affairs, is responsible for over 150 cemeteries and soldiers' plots. The U.S. Army maintains the Arlington National Cemetery and the U.S. Soldiers' Home Cemetery located in Washington, D.C. And the American Battle Monuments Commission is responsible for American military cemeteries located on foreign soil. Technology has incrementally allowed us to identify and recognize our fallen more effectively. We know the identities of those who gave their lives in the service of our nation. But technology also advances our ability to know more about those who made the ultimate sacrifice. And while we maintain our long-standing traditions to honor our fallen, as we've discussed, We also advance technology. One of the most recent programs is the Veterans Legacy Program, which is sponsored by the National Cemetery Administration, that allows individuals to go to an online platform to add information and background on every veteran who is interred in a national cemetery, as well as those who were killed in wartime. The attention paid to our fallen, unknown and known, is not accidental. It's bound to the very concept of a free nation and its special relationship with its citizen soldiers. Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel Visconage. We appreciate your heartfelt remarks and would like to present you with a small token of our gratitude from University Health. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes today's ceremony. Thank you all for participating in this special Memorial Day observance. Thank you, and God bless America.